Okay, I guess we will get going because it's now officially 9 o'clock. So thanks and welcome for joining me. Really quickly, the background of what this presentation is about. Last year, Daniel and we did an email list swap, which basically means he promoted me to his list, I promoted him to my list. And it turned out to be much more beneficial to me than to him because I got hundreds of new subscribers and I could witness firsthand how effective Daniel Throssell's email copy style is and his overall marketing, how effective it is. So what I saw is that Daniel promised to send something like 10% of his email list to my site, and I thought that was nonsense. And it turned out that he did more than that just with one email that he sent. A lot of those people ended up signing up to my newsletter. They opened my emails in numbers much better than the people who had been reading my emails consistently. They responded to my emails. They bought a lot of my products. In short, everything that you hope for email marketing to do for you or for your business, Daniel's list subscribers did very well. And previous to this, when I'd looked at his emails and his marketing, what I thought was, Daniel's stuff is very entertaining. He's good at telling funny stories. He's kind of cute. He has this online braggart persona where he's like a little bit cocky and funny, but that's all that I saw in his emails. I realized, having seen the actual engagement that he gets directly from his list, that there's clearly something else going on in the way that he writes his emails and that it's worth studying. So basically that was the background last year. And that's when I wrote that first critical look at Daniel Throssell email. And then a couple of weeks ago, Daniel offered to actually hire me to look at some of his emails and to see what I could see in his emails that maybe he didn't see because he's putting together a course. And the upshot was that he didn't hire me. Instead, we put this presentation out. He promoted it to his list. I promoted it to my list. I took a look at a bunch of emails of Daniel's, which stuck out the most in my mind. And it turned out to be a very good cross-section of Daniel's emails in terms of the style, in terms of the offers, in terms of the length. And the way that I wrote on that opt-in page, and as well as in my email promoting this event, some of the stuff that Daniel does is straightforward copywriting stuff. He's a very good copywriter, so he just does it very well, but it's stuff that you can read in a lot of copywriting guidebooks. Some of it is unique stuff, which he does and which he talks about in his email copywriting compendium. And then there were a couple of other things that I saw that he doesn't talk about and that I hadn't really seen discussed before, and yet that I saw repeatedly in his emails, and I saw repeatedly in those emails that I thought were that stuck out the most to me. And those are the things I'm going to be talking about today. So quickly, the schedule for today, I'm going to tell you these 3 techniques. I'm going to give you examples from Daniel's copy. I will give you an example from an email that I wrote using those 3 techniques, which did much better in terms of engagement than my average. And then at the end of that, I will answer any questions, and also I promised you a surprise gift that will come at the end. And if by any chance you are on this call specifically because I promised you the special gift and you need to get off the call early, then put your name in the chat. The chat will be saved, and I will make sure to get you the complete recording of this call rather than the edited recording of the call with the extra stuff that I promised you. So before we get into the techniques, there is one really important topic that I want to address, which is, can you use these techniques? So these are things that I identified in Daniel's copy. And the evergreen question is, okay, it works really well for Daniel, but who else can do this? So people don't have his email list, they don't have his persona, they don't have his history. Can other people use this? And I would say absolutely yes. But there is a caveat. When I told Daniel, when I first presented these techniques to him, he said, yeah, I do all these things consciously. But one of the reasons, or at least 2 of these techniques, the only reason he does it, the reason that he takes this extra step, is because he's writing to a very sophisticated market. So he's writing to marketers, he's writing to copywriters. And because of that, he has to basically amp things up. He has to make the emails much more exciting than he might have to do if you were writing to a dog list or something like that. And so with that caveat, I would say that means that if these techniques work very well, even on a very sophisticated market, they will work on any market. You can just basically lower the dose. You don't have to go all out the way that Daniel might do. You might not have to do it as often as he does, but it'll work to any market. And the second thing that I would want to say is that all of these things are also, they work not because they're unique tactics or techniques, but because they're doing something really fundamental. And I'll spell out for you what I think these tactics that Daniel is using, what they're actually doing, and then you can think about how these things can actually be applied in different ways, how these broader principles could be done, even if you're not using these specific techniques. And I think they're all illustrating very valuable marketing and copywriting principles. Okay, so let's jump into it. The first technique that I want to tell you about is what I called writing the void. And actually, a few weeks ago, Daniel wrote an email in which he talked about how he got tested for corona, and it turned out he has it, and now he's sick and he's coughing, and his wife is kind of teasing him because she didn't get sick and whatever. That was basically the intro. But in that email, Daniel actually kind of spelled out what it is that I'm going to talk about in this first point. And that's that he said that he writes his emails fresh every day. And it kind of sucks when he has corona and he's sick and he still has to write his email. But at the same time, it's also very good because it means that he has this real human connection with people where it's not can't stop an autoresponder. So that's the reason why this first thing, which I call writing the void, exists. But the thing is that Daniel doesn't just write his emails every day, but he actually bakes that into the process. So there are a bunch of emails where Daniel tells you that he's writing that email during the day, and he sneaks in extra things into the email to demonstrate that. So let me share my screen, and I will share a bunch of examples of from Daniel's copy. So just a second. Here we go. So I just shared my screen. If you guys can just in the chat tell me whether you can see a bunch of emails that are highlighted, then I will keep going with this stuff. Yep. Okay, cool. All right, so this is the corona email. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. So first of all, this is the stuff that I talked about. The introduction, Daniel is sick, but the real point that stuck out to me and that sticks out in a lot of emails is that basically Daniel brings you to the moment where he's writing the email. So he says, and that is where I'm now writing this email. And he's basically telling you like he's writing it live. So he doesn't just write these emails daily, but he actually introduces that, the fact he finds sneaky ways to introduce that into the email. So you realize that, you know, you can actually kind of take part in the process of his writing with him, right? And let me give you a couple of other examples, and then I'll tell you what I think this is actually doing. This is another email that Daniel wrote a while ago. This was about how he was in a shopping mall and he was looking for email ideas. And he says, I've been hoping for a crazy person to give me a story idea. Been a strange twist today. I've only encountered normal people doing normal things. Thankfully, though, something happened. So basically, he's telling you how he was hoping to write this email, but it didn't work out. And he actually then tells you how he wound up writing this email, right? So if you think about it, he could have cut all of this out. There's no reason to really tell you that he was planning to write a different email and now he's writing this email. But what this is actually communicating is exactly that thing that he mentions in the corona email, that he's writing to you fresh. It's not that he's just doing it, but he's pointing it out to you in different ways. This is the third example, which is actually mine. So I screwed up somewhere, just a second. There was a third example, which was 4 ways to write emails. And I don't know, I guess I'm not going to look for it now. I pulled up all of these emails, but I guess I deleted that email somewhere. But there was a more recent email where basically Daniel said, like, it's 5 p.m. today and I still didn't have an email idea. And then his wife, Haley, came up to him and she said, oh, you need an idea. And then it was an entire email just about the two of them going back and forth, because Haley kind of has this role in Daniel's emails of being like a bad idea machine that he tries to avoid all the time. And again, the point was that that entire email could have worked just as well with Haley coming up to him and giving him ideas, but he sneaked in this additional bit about him saying, you know, it was 5 o'clock already, I still didn't have an idea. And because of that, in my mind at least, it really made me see that these emails are fresh. And for some reason, that really stuck out in my mind, right? And I'll tell you actually what I think is going on here. But before I do that, I want to point out how you can do this as well. And so I think in any time that you don't have any ideas for your email, or you're struggling to come up with ideas, rather than just skipping over that and coming up with whatever the final result is going to be, you can actually introduce that fact that you had trouble coming up with an email topic for that day. You can put that into your email. Or if the writing of the email doesn't go as planned. So I had an example fairly recently where I wanted to write an email. I spent the entire day writing that email. It didn't work out the way that I wanted. I had to write a second email. And then in that second email, actually, I referred to the fact that I was trying to write a different email. It didn't work out. So yeah, if you're going to write about one thing, something happened. So now that you have to basically postpone the initial email, all of these are opportunities, not just to write a different email, but to actually highlight to your list that you're writing things fresh and that they're kind of there in that moment with you. In general, what I take away from this is just to be sensitive to the process of writing. And as the writing process is happening, if you notice that it's going in a different direction from where you anticipated, yeah, you can try to push it for a while. But if you notice that it's really getting stuck, rather than kind of like trying to bully your way through it, maybe there's an opportunity there. Maybe there's an opportunity to actually to turn that problem of being stuck, of not having a good idea, not being able to tie something up, and to actually make that into the content of the email. So just as a personal example, so last night I wrote about this email that I sent out using all three of these techniques that I identified in Daniel's copy, and the better results that I got in my own emails in terms of engagement, including an endorsement from former Agora Financial copy chief, Joe Schriefer. So this was the email. And this part here in yellow is exactly applying what I was just talking about. So it's this Daniel technique of telling you how I wrote this email. So in this case, what I did was, this really happened. I made a list, 10 problems I had in my life. One of those topics, one of the problems was basically the topic of the email that I had up to that point. Another problem that I had was that I had no email topic for today. And then I said, I took one of those problems, I turned it into an email, and now I don't at least have the problem of not having an email for today. A second example is another recent email that I had about different story archetypes. And this is actually what I was talking about. So I had tried to write an email about this guy, Tom Torero. I couldn't figure out a good way to write it in spite of multiple drafts. And then I told the story of trying to write that email as a way of illustrating basically what I was trying to initially illustrate, except that I also talked about that in the actual email. So I said, maybe you notice I'm sending out this email later than usual. That's because I couldn't get it done on time. I couldn't figure out how to do it, blah, blah, blah. Again, I'm putting you in the place where you are kind of privy to the writing process and the process that produced this email. Okay, so those are some illustrations. The bigger point for me in this is just, the first point is that this is something that I wrote about in reference to Daniel's Black Friday campaign as well. I really feel that today people are starved for something real. There's so much marketing out there. There's so much transparently bad manipulation that if somehow you can communicate to people that if you can communicate in a more honest way, and if you can tell them and really highlight the fact that you're communicating in a more honest way, people respond to that very strongly. And I think that's part of the reason why talking about even your failures, writing an email actually makes for a better email than just getting to the point right away. The second point for me that I take away from this is kind of what I was saying of being mindful of how the process of writing is going. And if you come across the problem, then it's this Joe Sugarman idea that every problem is ultimately an opportunity. And if you're stuck writing something, if it's not going well, if you don't know how to tie it up, if you don't have a good idea, if you're frustrated, whatever is happening, rather than trying to bully your way through it, use that kind of like Joe Sugarman opportunity judo, where you turn that problem into an opportunity and you figure out, how can I actually use this, right? And I think both of those things kind of contribute to just the idea of being transparent. And with email marketing, particularly kind of personality-driven email marketing, that Daniel does that does really well in daily emails. If you can be transparent and if you can highlight the fact that you're being transparent, so not just showing people that you're being transparent, but telling them and pointing to the places where you're being transparent, I think that works really well. Okay, so that was the first point, which I called riding the void, because you're kind of like on the edge of knowing what you're doing and at the same time not knowing what you're doing. So you're kind of surfing on this void of uncertainty. The next point that I want to tell you about is called just personal context instead of story. And Daniel initially asked me to look at a bunch of his story emails because he was looking for additional things he might put into his course about storytelling. And I took a bunch of emails that I remembered as being story emails. And then I looked at them and I said, you know what, actually, these are not stories at all. You know, Daniel talks a lot about the power of story. There's a bunch of other marketers and in general, like people who are telling you how to be an influential communicator who are saying there's a lot of value in stories. And then if you look at actually Daniel's maybe most influential emails, at least the ones that stuck out to me, they're not stories in the sense that there is no remarkable event. There is no beginning, there's no middle, there's no end, there's no progression. Nothing is really happening. Instead, it's just the concrete personal context. Daniel's telling you where he was, who he was with, why he was there, when this happened, and that's it. He's putting you in this place next to him, and there's no story in the sense of like, I went here, then there was a conflict, there were other people, I didn't think I could make it. So there's none of that classic storytelling structure. So examples again. And actually, let me just double check the chat to make sure I'm doing okay. Got it, okay. So examples again. This was an email that Daniel sent out last summer, why the world needs more copywriting gurus. And this stuff, I'm very bad with colors. I don't know what color this is, maybe blue, let's say, maybe purple, who the hell knows. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. So basically he's telling you, I went to get my corona test today. I was riding my bike and I saw a couple of billboards, right? That's not a story. Right? I mean, maybe the corona test could have been a story, but really he's just telling you, I went for a corona test today and I went there by bike and that's it. So nothing that you would traditionally consider to be a story. The second example is an email that Daniel sent out just a couple of days ago, which was this cheeseburger thing, which again, there's nothing here. He's having a cheeseburger and some beer with his family. And then he has this insight. Okay, now he realized something and he's going to tell you what that is. In a way, this entire email could work just as well. I mean, in theory, this email could work just the same without this beginning, without this stuff that I've highlighted. He could just tell you, I had a really great realization about why my emails work, and he could tell you everything else. But really, this part up here, even though there's no story, it makes it feel personal. And there's a subsequent part down here where he kind of continues this context. He's telling you about some guy who's staring at him. This doesn't go anywhere again. It's not like the guy and Daniel interact in some meaningful way and that they come together, that the story develops. It's just where he was, the guy was looking at him very strangely. Daniel noticed him and then he had a second insight. Again, all it is basically just putting you in that place, right? And then a third example of this is from this email that I already brought up, which was about this thing where he was looking for ideas and instead a billboard flashed in front of him, giving him the idea. And at the beginning of this thing, it's again kind of the same context. So he's just telling you, he today is writing this email from a shopping mall, his car is getting fixed, and that's it, right? So it's just the personal context without actually being a personal story. So how you can do this too is, again, just give people personal context, when, where, why. It's basically all the stuff that traditionally in good writing, you might want to skip, right? So I feel like I used to do this in my own emails a lot, where there's this idea that if you write 7 pages of copy, you should throw away the first 2 pages because it's basically just clearing your throat and telling people stuff that they don't need to know. And then you're finally getting to the valuable stuff, which is going to be interesting to the reader as well. And that's good advice if you're maybe writing a screenplay or if you are writing a sales letter. But if you're doing email marketing, particularly something where you want people to bond with you specifically, then you got to throw in this stuff that you would normally want to toss out. I mean, you want to keep this stuff in you would normally toss out. So you want to tell people where you are when you're writing the email, why you're there, and so on, even though the traditional advice about writing any kind of copy is like, who cares, right? It's unless it's directly connected to making the sale, unless it's directly connected to building up your authority and proof, throw it out. But obviously not, right? Because I feel like this is a big part of why Daniel's list is so engaged, is because he's sharing these personal details all the time, even though they're not really stories. And that is kind of the second point of how you can do this. So give people personal context and then make that context personally revealing. That's one option. And this is something that Daniel does all the time. So one thing is that in this example about he was at the mall, he's kind of using this thing to say that he's not a typical guru. He's not showing off his money. He doesn't have a fancy car. He's just kind of a modest suburban dad. The 28 hamburger thing was really an excuse to say that he's out with his family and that maybe he can afford this ridiculously expensive hamburger and so on. So again, all this really is an opportunity to share personal details. Or on the other hand, if you don't want to share personal details, I'm not crazy about sharing personal details in my emails just because I'm a closed person and I don't like putting that stuff out there. Then I would say make that context that you're sharing, if it's not personal, then make it rich or interesting in itself. And with that, I'll give you a couple of examples of stuff in my own copy. So again, with this, where was it? This Baker Street email, right? So I started out this email basically saying how I'd gone for a walk, right? And I just said, a beautiful sunny morning and the trees and the birds are out and cats are meowing or whatever. I just gave people something that I thought was a context for where I was without really talking too much about myself. But still, I try to make it somehow rich and interesting enough that it was a context about me, but even though that not specifically about me, but it was interesting enough that people might want to read it and get some sort of additional emotional involvement with these emails that they might not have gotten otherwise. Another example that I can give you from a personal email, which I kind of consciously parroted Daniel's style, is that I had this email a few days ago about David Ogilvy, and basically I was reading a David Ogilvy ad, and I could have skipped all of this and just started off by saying David Ogilvy has this famous ad, how to make advertising pay, but instead I kind of made up this little context, which was a little bit absurd, but it was a personal context nonetheless. I sat down, I took a sip of my coffee, I lit my pipe, I put on my eye patch, and if you know, all of these are kind of references to David Ogilvy, the guy who smoked a pipe. He had those ad campaigns with the Hathaway man or whatever the hell it was, the guy with the most interesting man with the eye patch. And actually, I was going to make it Maxwell coffee because Ogilvy promoted Maxwell coffee as well. Anyhow, so all I'm saying is that you can make the personal context. It doesn't have to be necessarily like stuff that you don't want to share, like too much information from your personal life. You can either make it a little bit absurd while still somehow sharing personal stuff, or you can just make it a little bit more not about you, but just somehow, let's say, inherently interesting, which is that previous example I tried to give you. The bigger point for this thing, kind of the underlying principle for the second thing, is that this context stuff does two really important things. The first is being just concrete, and the second is sharing personal stuff. And I think both of these are super important in email marketing. So making things concrete, this is important, not just in email marketing, any kind of copywriting, any kind of persuasion. If you can paint a picture in somebody's head, if they can imagine details, if you're telling them about hamburgers as opposed to food items, all of that stuff is much more effective, right? And if you can put somebody in the place where you were when you're writing this email, that makes that email stick in people's heads much more than if you give them the same valuable information without those details. The second part is that personal reveals stick with people, and they don't have to come through stories, right? Lots of times, the things that I remember about people who are influential marketers who have been influential in my career, I feel I know something about them. I know things that they did, people they were influenced by, troubles that they've had. And when I try to dig up those emails or those newsletters or wherever that I found that, I find often the same thing that happens here with Daniel. Basically, he's sharing personal details, but he's not sharing them necessarily through a story. You can just paint a picture, you can create a snapshot of your life for somebody, and they will feel they're connecting with you, even though you're not really sharing any kind of personal story. Okay, so that's the second one of these points. And then the third one that I want to tell you about is the mock and the real email close. So this isn't so much about the story as about the way that that story fits in with the rest of the email, or in general, as kind of how it makes for a piece of sales copy. So I noticed a bunch of Daniel's emails have the structure where there's a beginning, which is an email body, which is a story that he tells, or this personal context that he just told you about, or it's some realization that he had, or he's answering a question. So there's kind of the body of the email. And then he maybe gets into some sort of talking about his product or whatever. He's giving you some sort of marketing lesson. And then there's a close that you think you're getting closed. He's basically, you expect that he's going to say like, and that's why you should go and check out my sales page here. And instead it turns out that, oh, actually, no, he's not actually giving you the close here. So you could say it's kind of a false close, except the false close is usually like a sales technique in an infomercial where you're like, I bet you're wondering how much all of this amazing stuff is going to cost, whether it would be $89 or $200 or $300, but wait, there's more, right? And you think you're going to get closed, but you're not. So this is kind of similar to that, but I think Daniel does it in a much more playful and interesting way. So let me give you a couple of examples so you can see exactly what I mean. So this was an email that Daniel sent out pretty recently about how he was at a kid's playground and there was a slide and the kids were flying off that slide and getting injured, and he was just kind of standing by and writing his email. And then the email ends and he says, and I'm kicking myself. Why am I kicking myself? Because this is probably the single best story I've ever had in my life for lending itself to a greased shoot metaphor. And basically saying that if he had his storytelling course ready, this would have been a perfect email to use, right? So he's kind of setting it up, but it's actually not happening. And then in the end, he sells you a different product, right? A second example here is this was an email that Daniel sent out about how his wife lost her wedding band, right? And then he's telling you, he went out there, he was looking for the wedding band for a long time. He couldn't find it. The kids were out there. He kind of promised them that they would find it because God would help them. It still didn't work out. In the end, they found it, but it was by hiring a guy to go out there with a metal detector. And then there's this close where Daniel writes it in big capital letters. If you want to find real gold like this guy just did, then check out the Black Friday bundle. And then he cuts it off. So again, it's kind of this thing where he's leading you to believe that there might be a close, even though he's highlighting that's probably not real by making it all caps. And then he says, no, I'm just kidding. Oh, goodness me, how bad that would be. And then he's basically saying how this story was really good, even though it was probably overdone for being a sales email, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, he still sends you to an actual offer. But before that, there is this thing where he is actually kind of teasing you or slightly misdirecting you down a certain path where you think that you're getting close, but you're actually not. A third example was a couple of days ago, he wrote an email about how he writes sales letters, and he writes sales letters, whatever. The rest of the email isn't pertinent to this, but basically in a very small way, he's doing the same thing here. He's telling you, I've written 3 of these things. Would you like to see the first one? Well, it's not ready. Would you like to see the second one? Oh, actually, that's not ready as well. Oh, the third one, that is ready, and that's here, right? So in a way, he's kind of doing that same thing here. Maybe you're wondering that whether these things are all really the same. I'll try to convince you in just a second that they are. But before that, how you can do this as well. Again, kind of like with the first thing that I was talking about encountering problems while you're writing, and then calling it out in your email. I feel like there is a part of this which is similar to that. So if you notice that your email, the content of your email, the story doesn't really match up with the offer. If it's somehow if it's not really a good fit in terms of making the point that you would need to sell that offer, or if it's just overly dramatic in the way that this story that Daniel is telling here about losing his wedding band, it's, I don't know how long this is. I can imagine this is 1,200 words or more. It's a long, really involved story with kind of like an intermission in between where he has a flashback, and it's very dramatic. And, Daniel even says in this email that it's too much probably for a normal sales email, right? And I feel that the fact that he calls that out actually makes the email stronger, right? So in any one of those situations where you realize that the close somehow doesn't fit, you can use this technique. But there's a second thing, which is that I think you can do this even when the email could fit just fine, right? So for example, with this third thing that I just pointed out with the sales letters, right? He could have just said, this is about how he writes emails, or how he writes his sales letters without using a template, and he starts from a blank page. And he could have just said, oh, you want to see an example? Here's a sales page that I wrote just this way without this. The first one was this, but you can't see that yet. The second one was that, but you can't see that yet. And the third one was, oh, you can actually see that. And I think that what this is actually doing is making the email stronger, because as I'll try to convince you in just a second, I think that if he had that same email and then he gets to the point of being like, oh, and by the way, would you like to see the sales letter that I wrote starting with a blank page? Well, it happens to be my most recent course. I feel a certain number of people would have a reaction of saying like, well, isn't that convenient? You've kind of manipulated me into this thing. And wasn't it convenient that your email led so well to this demonstration? That's not to say that you can't have a direct sales pitch, or that there's a problem, or that you need to be super mindful of people who are overly sensitive to being sold. But there is a certain part of all of our brains which is guarded to being influenced and persuaded. And I feel that this thing, even if the email fits perfectly with the close, this is a way of actually diffusing some of that resistance that we all feel to being manipulated and persuaded. So really quickly, I guess my own examples, I don't have good examples of this because most of the stuff that I've written lately, I haven't really been selling anything. So the Baker Street email to some extent does this, because I kind of have a closing idea where I'm saying like, okay, everything that I've just told you, you can do it too, and it could be useful. It's always worked well for me like that, except that I have this added part where I'm basically saying everything that I just told you now, that I'm not selling anything. And so I bring that in as kind of an objection, and I use it to, let's say, pre-sell a future email that I'll send out about the problem of not having enough offers to sell, right? So I have the email, I have the, let's say, the first close where I'm just trying to sell you the idea, which was the email. And then rather than ending with that, I have kind of a continuation where I'm actually selling you something else, which in this case is just the subsequent email. And then another example of this is a couple of days ago, for the first time in a couple of years, I actually broke the email chain where I didn't write an email that day, or I did write an email, just ActiveCampaign didn't send it out for some reason. And then I had an email explaining what had happened. And then I did exactly what Daniel did on purpose. I said, if I had a course, so the same way that he was saying, if he had his email storytelling course ready, he could have sold it and it would have been perfect. And I said, everything that just happened would have been perfect if, for example, I had a course about how to write faster, right? And then I even gave like a little sales pitch that I could have used and said, blah, 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 it would have been great. But instead I didn't have that. And so again, I was just pre-selling the next email that I would send out. Okay, so those were the examples. The bigger point for this is a kind of, again, going back to some of those ideas from point one, is that transparency works really well. And if you're building an email around a relationship with you as a persona, it's much better to be transparent. And if things aren't working perfectly, that it's much better to call it out. And actually the fact that you're calling out something that isn't working, for example, a story that doesn't match up perfectly with the close you're trying to make, if you do call it out, it actually can work even better than an email where the story matches up perfectly with the close. That's what I'm trying to say. And again, this kind of matches up with the writing the void concept from the beginning. And then there is the thing that people have expectations when it comes to sales emails. So all of us, or most of us, are aware of what's happening, right? So people who tend to get on email newsletters, people who tend to respond to sales letters, it's a part of the population, right? And most of those people aren't responding for the first time. There's a part of the population which will never sign up for an email newsletter. They'll never get out their email. They will never buy from a direct response sales letter. To some extent, that's changing now because there's so much online buying, and even Amazon is in a way, is a direct response business. But still, there are people who just do not respond well to direct response marketing. The fact is that people who do respond to direct response marketing are responding over and over and over. Which means that they have expectations. They know that if they're getting an email that looks like my email, where I'm telling you some personal story, there's going to be a pitch coming, right? And in a way, like I said, that can be a problem because it creates a certain amount of resistance. You can actually use that fact to your advantage rather than to your detriment. And I've been reading a book by Darren Brown. If you've been on my newsletter more than just the past 2 days, you might have seen me referring to it. The book is called Tricks of the Mind. It's a very worthwhile read if you're interested in persuasion. Brown is kind of a magician and a stage mentalist. And one thing that he says is that the audience for a magic trick, they will focus intensely while the magic trick is apparently going on. So the guy is doing some tricks with the cards and he's saying, okay, focus. And there's a mental episode that kind of wraps up this magic trick. And as soon as that episode finishes, so basically the guy, he's saying, I'll pick your card, yeah, whatever, pick a card, I'll figure out what the card is. He does some shuffling, blah, blah, blah. And then he figures out what your card is. And you say, oh, wow, that's really cool. And then at that moment you relax and you're kind of looking around and maybe you're laughing with your friends, be like, how did he do that? And you think that the trick is over. And what good magicians often do is during that time that your attention drops down because you think that the show is over, he'll actually do some really, really crazy stuff, which is really not that crazy. It's just that your attention is gone. And therefore the magician can actually do something very obvious, but because you're not paying attention, in the next moment, you're going to be incredibly impressed that suddenly that same card or a duplicate of that card has appeared in your pocket, or it's in your back pocket, or it's in your wallet, or wherever. There's no way that it could have happened, but actually it very easily could have happened. It's just that you completely let down your guard because you thought the trick was over. And I think that something similar is happening in sales letters. And I think that in the same way, what I was trying to say is that, these examples of Daniel's, let's say, false closes, where he's kind of trying to sell you something that he ends up not selling you, I think that diffuses some of that reactance that almost all of us have, right? So those were the three things: the writing the void, the personal context, and the final one was the mock and the real email close. So those are the three things. If there are any questions, I guess I will